The altar today has this large picture of Swami Kriyananda, which is not our usual design. But the 21st of April, which was Friday, was the anniversary, 4-year anniversary of the day when Swami Kriyananda left his body. So there was a celebration, and to a certain extent this whole weekend is dedicated to that. It's interesting. We have Easter comes at this season, Master's Mahasamadhi comes at this season, and Swami's does. It's sort of the thank you and goodbye time of the year. For all of us, it's quite something. Some of us, many of you, and Dharmadas and Nirmala and I certainly, our lives have been wholly defined by the life of Swami Kriyananda, and many of you have known him for a long time, or at least a little bit. And so his departure from this planet was a notable event. Well anticipated. His age was quite pronounced. His body was a miracle he was still in it. He'd been to the edge of leaving it many times over the years that we'd known him. Nirmala was reminding me in 1981 he was ready to leave his body. And a lot of things happened after that. It wasn't merely that he did use his body to work out a lot of karma for a lot of people, and the establishment of Ananda and many other things that I have no way of understanding. It was also that he was ever ready at any moment to have the incarnation over. He was here in order to serve God and Guru, and he would serve as long as they asked him to. But the personal commitment he had profoundly was to doing God's will and to fulfilling the expectations that Master had put in him that he would do a great work. I remember myself many years ago, as it was actually 1981, now that we mentioned that year. I'd been given an assignment by Swamiji to try to make Ananda village into a California city. This was the last desperate effort on our part to see if we could extricate ourselves from what was then enormous disapproval from the local neighbors and the chaos of county government that made our development extremely difficult. I mean, they've only just now gotten another master plan through, so I can tell you how hard it was. This is the second one, though. So we investigated and found out that the only government entity that has control over land use is a municipality. And even though Ananda Village in 1981 was, 500 or I guess it was 1,000 acres of land and about 200 people, actually it qualified by a certain reading of the law. Law is funny. There's another law in Nevada County that says as long as there's a contiguous roof line, you can expand your house. And it's not a separate house. There is one house in Nevada County that apparently has a 400-foot continuous roof line. And everybody knows it, but there it is. It's just what it is. So we had this project to try to turn our farm into a California city. I was going to be the mayor. And from the beginning, every time I came down the hill from where I lived at Ayodhya, Ananta, whom you know well, who was working in the garden then, would line up all the gardeners, and they would all say, "Morning, Madam Mayor," like that. And then I would climb into this ratty old barn that we've since torn down up into the spider-infested attic to the mayor's office and work on the project. Now, where am I going with this? Oh, yes. It was intensely controversial. And by the time we finished, we were in the largest hall in Nevada City. We had 800 people there. We had a hearing that went from 7 in the evening until 2 in the morning. And everybody, except for us, was against it. Everybody. All hundreds of those people. The only people who were for it was us. Suffice to say, we lost, and it was quite an adventure. But we lost because they illegally considered religion as part of the deliberations, which was not allowed. So we vowed that we would sue. We were going to go on like this. We stood in front of the television cameras, and by then I had 2 lawyers working with me, Nidruva, Dallas. We were going to sue like this. And the next morning, a crew came up from Sacramento, drove all the way up to Nevada City, and I was going to host them. We had no telephones then, you should know, and computers, emails didn't exist. So I meet this crew at the downstairs, the market area, and I'm going to drive them up to Swami's house. We didn't have the road through, so there's this long road all the way up. I'm telling them about our civil rights, it's a free country, religion, like this, bing, 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 bing. And we get there, and Swami announces to this crew, I have a special scoop. I loved it when he would use words like that. I have a scoop for you, he said. If you'll give me a little more time, I'll read it. Jyotish is standing there. I said, what? 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 And Jyotish just goes kind of white. And he says, he didn't tell you? And it's like, what? What? But they're there. So Swami sits in front of the camera and he starts reading this statement. And I'm very attuned to language. In the first 3 words, I could tell the project was in the past tense. When did it end? So he reads this whole statement and he says, basically, church and state should remain separate. It was actually a beautiful statement. When a group constituted for one purpose goes over into another, and actually totally predicted what's happened now in politics, where to be Christian is a political thing and so on. He talks about what a disaster that is, both for politics and religion. And he said that even though they were in error, he actually felt they made the right decision, so we were dropping the whole project. So they turned the camera on me, and I turn on a dime and talk about, of course Swami's right, isn't it wonderful? This is exactly what we're going to do. This crew is from Sacramento. They are used to politicians. They didn't bat an eye. So I drive all the way back down the hill. Of course we're going to stop. Why would we not stop? I wave goodbye. I get back in the car. I go all the way back the hill. Swami, sir, what was this about? And he just smiled so sweetly. He said, well, there was no way to reach you. You look so devilish. And he said that he was meditating that morning, and he offered the project to Master, and he felt Master say, enough. You've done what you needed to do, and there were a whole lot of reasons why it was still a good thing to have done. You've done what you need to do, put it down now. I said, I'm the one working on the project. Why didn't he tell me? Swami said, did you ask? I said, no. End of conversation. Whenever Swami would tell me the truth, no matter how much I didn't like it, end of conversation. And that was it. And it was over at that point. It was now there's about 5 different threads here. The first one was that simple question, did you ask? No, sir, I presumed. I presumed if it was right yesterday, it's right today. I presumed that if I'm committed to it and if I'm working on it, I should just keep working on it. But then what happened, and this is the thread I was picking up, soon after that, I went out of town for a while. I got very sick. I got a very high fever. But I know what was happening before. I had to think all of a sudden, what am I really doing with my life? Am I trying to make Ananda into a California city? And then I could list you all the reasons why it was a great idea and would have been a great idea. All of that. Or was I doing what God wanted me to do? Now, my particular life, Swami Kriyananda was the vehicle for me. My relationship to him was by no means blind obedience. I think at times he would have preferred it had been a little quieter. But I became convinced from my own experience that his judgment was more reliable than mine. So whenever he wanted something, I did my very best to cooperate with him. Not always by any means successfully, but I always tried to understand what he wanted and to do it. And sometimes it was sort of like, what the heck? Like, you want a California city, why not? What do I care? I'll put my energy into it. But I'd worked for 18 months, day and night on that thing, and then in a minute it was over. So what am I doing with my life? Am I trying to do what God and Guru want me to do, or am I picking up my projects and running with them? And it was extremely interesting just to be absolutely stopped in your tracks like that. Bingo. And it was, I got it down to this. Our neighbors, with whom we now have, all these years later, we have all worked it out, more or less, but they were nasty. They were really nasty at that time. And I said to Swamiji, I really don't mind losing, but it sure annoys me that they won. And it really came down to this, I don't like you and I don't want you to get what you want. I'll give up what I want, but I don't want you to get what you want. And then I got really sick and I had this really high fever, which is very unusual for me. So for about 3 days I just burned with fever. And when I woke up I didn't care. It was fine. They could have it. What difference did it make? My life was for God. Everything that we do, that's all that matters. And I was thinking in that context, all of us came into Swami Kriyananda's life after he was expelled from SRF and after he'd begun his own ministry. And his own ministry for Master and Ananda, we're all sitting here because of this man. So we don't always, even those of us who knew him well, couldn't always sort of really see the magnitude of what was going on in front of us because he was so natural and easy in his way. But when I start thinking about it, he was 22 years old when he met Master. He had dropped out of college. He was trying to be a playwright. He dropped out of being a playwright. He just really was he didn't know where he was going to go and what he was going to do. He had all this immense energy and tremendous talent, enormous expectation of the people who knew him, that he would either be a great singer or a great poet or something like this. But he himself had absolutely hit the wall, and he was 22. His parents had gone to Egypt. He's in New York City. He reads Autobiography of a Yogi. Any of you heard him speak at the end of his life, this is pretty much the only thing he would talk about, no matter what the topic was. He would tell us all again about how he met Master, because I think that's all that was left, really, in his awareness. I don't mean his mind was gone, but everything had come down to simply that. So he does, and he's accepted immediately as a disciple, all of that story that you know. Then 14 years later, he's called to New York City. He's living in India. He's called to New York City. He's expelled from SRF. He's given $500, and he's told, have a good life. Don't contact anybody that you ever knew. Don't tell anyone that you're a Master's disciple. Don't be any part of SRF, quite apart from the politics of it. That's not what I'm talking about. He's 36 years old. He's never had a life except this life. And all of a sudden, he's by himself in New York City. By the grace of God, his parents just returned from Europe right then, landed in New York. They're driving across the country to California. So here he is, 36 years old. He's done this thing that his parents think is absolutely loony, especially his father. Just thought it was totally nuts. And now it is completely blown up in his face. And absolutely, just think of how many levels this is happening on. He's totally disconcerted. And now he has to go to his parents. And so they put him in the back seat of the car. He drives back to California and goes to live in their guest room. He's absolutely alone. He's penniless. Well, he has $500. He has nice parents who are well off, so he has a place to live. He's not homeless. He's friendless, without direction, without experience. All he has is his discipleship. He doesn't even have his guru bhais. And even the ones that he thought were speaking for his guru, which of course makes it even more complicated, have now told him fiercely, don't ever be a disciple anymore, you're finished. So he doesn't even have any security from any point of view except his own heart and how that heart relates to his guru. And from that moment, here we are. Just think of that. Sometimes we lose the main event because we get so confused by the details. And to bring it back to my municipality, the effort to make Ananda a city, I'm just going to do something completely silly in the middle of this. We never could decide whether to be Ananda Town or Ananda City. At the very end, we realized that it would be Ananda, S-I-D-D-H-I, Ananda Siddhi. Which Siddhi means, for those of you who don't know, spiritual power. So we were going to be Ananda Siddhi, but unfortunately we couldn't be. But there anyway, so coming back to that point, it's like from that point, what was Swami going to do? So of course he cast about. And he chose communities, one, because he was called to it, but he cast about because he didn't want to compete with SRF. He lived for many years under the illusion that somehow there would be a reconciliation. But it was, well, this is something my guru wants, so I'll do what my guru wants. And every day of his life, unlike me, who I got lost in the project, every day of his life, it was once again, here, I'm giving this all back to you. And he would often tell us that, give it back to God every night. Give everything that you are back to God. And I had the most interesting, it was so interesting with Swamiji how I would often think he had a good attitude. And it would take me time to realize he didn't have a good attitude. He had the right consciousness. Sometimes I have a good attitude. I am not very happy about what's happening, and I don't really like the way you're talking to me, but oh, I'm so glad. Let's do it. That's a good attitude. Swami's was not a conscious sense of discipline. It was simply following the path of a disciple, and then everything else manifested from that. He had first things first. And when I was talking about this handing things over to God every night, I worked for him for about 4 years as his secretary, maybe a little less than that. It was primarily during the time he was writing The Path. The Path was the last book he wrote before he got a computer. So he wrote it on an electric typewriter. He's an avid editor. So he edits, especially that book, dozens of times he would go over a page. He also, the way he worked, that if there was any mark on the page, he couldn't be sure that it was correct. So he would retype and retype and retype. And when I began to work for him, I offered to do a lot of that retyping for him. At first he wouldn't let me, because he also would edit as he would type. But this was the biggest book he'd written, and gradually, and he was also, he wasn't sure I would do it right, and that I would miss changes and so on. But gradually we worked it out. So he would work during the day, I would come in about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then I would retype whatever was there to retype. I did this every day. I had no life except being his secretary, working with him every afternoon at 4 o'clock. I mean, sometimes people would say to me, oh, I'd like to really be with Swami as much as you are, but they had other priorities. I did not. Because when I would go over there at 4 o'clock, I never knew when I would leave. I wasn't the only one. Seva, Prem's mother, Kalyani, often went. Others of us would go. But we'd go at 4. Sometimes we leave at 4:30. Sometimes we leave at midnight. Sometimes we leave at 10 at night. You just never knew. You could have no plans, zero. Because I was never going to say to Swami, no, sir, I can't do it. I have to go. So there was no life. It was all life to me. But there was no life except that. But I would come in every day to do this. He knew perfectly well. But it would always go like this. And this is what I learned. He would never say, Asha, I have manuscript for you, or go in the office, there's paper there. First it would be like, oh, there you are. And like, sir, it's 4, it's life, we're here. But it would always be, oh, there you are. And then we'd have, why don't you put on some tea, let's have some conversation. And then I would bring it around, or he might say, oh, I had a very good day, or I did a chapter, you'll find it interesting. I would say, did you have a good writing day? Yes. I said, perhaps there's some pages you would like me to type? Oh, would you be kind enough? Really? Do you have anything else to do? And none of this was affectation. And later on, I talked to him about this, because I wrote this up in the book I wrote about him, and I talked with him about everything that's in that book. But I said, Swamiji, my feeling was that every single time I showed up, you were surprised. And he said, yes. And every time I was ready to work for you, you were like renewed gratitude. He never saw me as the girl who came over to type his manuscript, ever, not once. That I even showed up was like he'd given it all to God. That's all. He'd given everything to God. Now think about the freedom of that. Just think about that. If we really can, if whatever it is that we're carrying, all the people that we love, all the things that we think we're responsible, all the little habits that we rely on. Recently I lost my favorite coffee cup. I must have written 10 emails. Does anybody know where my coffee cup is? I have all these guests in my house. I wrote to everyone who'd been a guest, did you put it away somewhere? You know, and I wasn't kidding. I mean, it's just a coffee cup, but it was just the right shape, color, you know. And I think, oh my God, just look at us. Just look at us. And Swamiji lived, you see, he set such an interesting example that it was easier to misunderstand it than it was to understand it. Because he was so enthusiastic, he was so exuberant, he was so interested in everything, he was so completely relaxed and natural. I carried a tape recorder around for a number of years, and I have a lot of informal recordings. I can't let them out because some of them should not be heard more than the small groups that were there, but over time we'll find a way. But what was so astonishing in the conversations that were just around the tea table and in the car and in various places, it was just so at ease. And everybody around him was so at ease, and everybody just, so you didn't realize that what was going on in front of you was of a wholly different order of magnitude. Because I had a good attitude and he seemed to have one too. And I didn't understand for a long time, for too long, that he wasn't being polite. He was just being himself. And that self was so simple. It was just such a simple self. He had been, at the age of 36, in his parents' bedroom, in his parents' house, lying on his back, as he described it, praying to die. Because he just thought his life was over at that point. And then he had one thing. He had discipleship to Master and Master's expectation of him, and that was enough. Is it enough for us? No. It was enough for him because of the way he committed every ounce of himself to it. And he went through many adventures. He was sued, he was vilified, he married, he divorced, he was a Swami, he wasn't, he was a Swami again, his health was terrible. You know, a lot of things strangely appeared to happen to him. But from his perspective, nothing ever happened to him. The only thing that happened to him was every morning, every night, Master, what would you like me to do? Shall we continue? Shall we stop? Okay, if this is what you want, nothing will stop me. And if this is what you don't want, nothing on earth can induce me to go forward. Swami said once about being expelled from SRF, I actually said to him when I really began to understand it, I said, sir, the wonder was not that they threw you out, the wonder was that they kept you so long. And he says, I was a little difficult. Not because he was disobedient, but he said when he felt strongly about something, you know, he would obey, but he would never change. And many times to me it was odd, you know, because I got myself in trouble sometime, being a little outspoken and various other things which are not worth enumerating, but let's just suffice to say there it was. And sometimes I would say, but sir, what should I do? He said, if you think you're right, never give in. That was a strange advice, especially to give to me. If you think you're right, don't give in. It's just like, that's the power. But he didn't mean if you in your little ego prefer this. He wasn't saying if this is your opinion. He meant if I was involved once in an extremely controversial thing. And that was when we all went down to self-realization convocation and demonstrated because we were in the lawsuits, and we did this public demonstration at their convocation. It was, not everybody thought it was a good idea, suffice to say. And I was talking to Swami, well, sir, do you think we should do it? And he expressed his concerns. And I said, well, sir, the idea to do it came to me, as I put it, in that way. That rarely happens, but when it does, you know it's right. And I said, of course it's going to succeed, sir. I'm absolutely certain it will, because it came to me in that way. And he was so sweet. Oh, then of course you have to do it. Just like that. And believe me, he didn't always support my opinions. But there was a reality to that. And whatever else Swami did for us, he absolutely lived every minute of his life. I am a disciple of a great master. And every day of my life is dedicated to his will and only to his will. And yes, I can make mistakes. When he stopped being a Swami and began to live with this woman named Parameshwari, who stayed with him for about 9 months and then vaporized. And just, that was it. I mean, she didn't literally vaporize, but she vaporized as far as our life was concerned. She vaporized just before all the national papers were announcing that Swami Kriyananda was now married and all this. And it was memorable. And I remember sitting in the living room with him, and we're looking at the Yoga Fellowship, Yoga Journal magazine, in which there are all these pictures and this marvelous article explaining why he's no longer Swami, why he's going to live as a householder, and she's already gone. It's all over. And he says, "This is a very embarrassing situation." He said, "But I choose not to be embarrassed." Just like that, so what? However, it was a very difficult period for him just before that, because he had felt inwardly guided to do this, and now it hadn't come out at all as he expected. And the crisis for him was not that the woman was gone. The crisis for him was, had he misunderstood Master? And he just went into himself, and for 2 or 3 weeks, he was either out of sight, or when he was present, he was absent. He just wasn't there. And then one day he just pops up, and he was absolutely restored. And he said, the reason I did this, as he'd written in all these articles, was to correct some very energy in the community. It was just completely wacky. But I'll give it very briefly. But the wacky energy was everybody was behaving as they thought they ought to behave. And we had about 70 people in the monastery, of whom about 10 actually belonged. But everybody was behaving as they thought they ought to behave. If I'm dedicated, this is what I would do. And just this whole horrible thought form of living our lives from the outside was growing. And Swami knew it would be the death of Ananda. And it partly had to do with monasticism and marriage, which is where that reason came out. So he felt we needed to straighten this out. So he prayed to Master, and the end result was this. And he eventually did meet Rosanna and actually did get married again. But let me just say the point. But what happened was, Swami totally stepped out of the box, went in a direction that was really not what you were supposed to do, because he felt inwardly that Master was guiding him to do it. And then what happened to the whole community was, oh yeah, maybe I should live according to what I feel is right for me, rather than what looks right and what I'm supposed to do. I mean, that might seem self-evident, but religious organizations mostly go that way. This is how I'm supposed to be, so this is how I am. And when Swami just basically blew everybody's expectations, then it just knocked everybody back onto, what do I feel inside? What does Master want me to do? And Swamiji said, well, when he came out of that, he said, the correction was made. Everything I'd hoped to happen, happened. He said, so just because the form was entirely different, I had this expectation, he realized. He had this expectation that it would look a certain way. But really all he'd wanted to do was what Master wanted him to do, and well, there it was. Think of the freedom. If every day we can, with absolute sincerity, know, I've really just given it all to Master. And some of it he gives back. Some of it he rearranges and gives back. And some of it you give it to him and you never see it again, like my coffee cup. Which happens, and you lose bigger things than that. And it's more or less terrible as it happens. But the waves on the surface of the sea are not what counts. What counts is that really deep part of the ocean. What is the reason why I'm living? What is the center point of my life? What is the basis for everything that I do? And in that, we have no greater example than Swamiji, for which we should be forever grateful.